Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today I'm really pleased to welcome Steven Orr to the Sports Psych Show and to welcome back Ian Peake. Gents, great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having us, Dan.
Morning, Dan. Great to be here.
Great to have you both on. We'll start as we always do, getting you to introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience. Steven, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sure. No, I'm absolutely happy to. So thanks for having us on today, Dan. I'm very happy to be here. So, my background is I'm a golf coach for near enough about 20 years now. Kind of a full-time player before I moved into coaching. And in the last 10 years, I've kind of split that time coaching and spending time in the academic world. So I finished a master's at Birmingham University, and I'm kind of about a year or so away from getting to the end, hopefully, of a professional doctorate at the University of Central Lancashire. And my kind of field of research is skill acquisition and technical training in elite golfers. So kind of spending my time in those kind of two camps, really. So a lot of coaching, more with kind of players, aspiring players, and quite a bit of time doing research at the moment as well. So that's how I'm spending my time at the moment.
A real pracademic, mate.
Yes, indeed, absolutely.
Awesome. And Ian, pracademic as well. You've been on the show before.
I have. You've even let me come back on, Dan.
Yeah, no, delighted to have you back on, mate. It's been. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think when it was, but something about a year or year and a half ago. Listen, mate, why don't you reintroduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Great, thanks. Yeah, Ian Peake, similar to Steven, I've been coaching at the coalface almost for 30 years now. Like Steven, also a PGA Master coach. It's a great honour. I got that back in 2019, and I've also been an academic since really 2013 when I went to university to find out more about coaching and the science behind coaching. Did my master's degree similar to Steven. I finished in 2016, and I said on your last show, that was October 19, that really lit my fires, Dan, for understanding high performance, particularly in the golfing sphere. So I started my PhD in 2017, now in my fourth year, and looking at kind of the stuff behind the scenes of very successful European Tour players. So there's 13 of them helping with my studies in my second year now of research, of data collection, and basically understanding their world and kind of what the kind of key incidents were behind their careers, the highlights, and also the challenges they faced.
Well, I just think it's fascinating. I just had a little look there, Ian, and I think it was episode 61 that you came on the Sports Psych Show, and as you say, we talked quite a bit about your work investigating the personality and mindset and what it takes to be a European Tour golfer. And behind the scenes, the three of us have spoken about what we're going to talk about today at length, and we've come up with a few topics that I'm really, really looking forward to talking about. And I was surprised and delighted, Steven, to have you sort of say to me, well, one of the topics I want to talk about is something that actually you first came across, or I don't know if you first came across, but it caught your attention. Motivational interviewing. You listened to the Stephen Rolnick episode that I did, and it's something that you went on to learn more about, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. That was the first time that I heard Stephen Rolnick speaking. Was on your podcast, and I think that was just before lockdown, and kind of the first lockdown that we had at the start of last year. And what it really did, it kind of piqued a real interest. I found it a fascinating podcast, and it really had me keen to learn and understand more about it. And I think it was because I realised at some level that the conversations that I was having with players wasn't at the level that that I wanted them to be at. It was very interesting, and lockdown gave me a chance to spend some time really trying to understand it better. And that journey is still ongoing. I've still got a lot to learn in that area, but I've definitely I did some further training online with Stephen Rolnick and Bill Miller, Teresa Moyers, their online course, and still just trying to implement some of those skills as we speak with players on a daily basis. So I'm very, very happy to chat to them. I know it's an area of interest for you as well. So I think behaviour change is something for me that I've become more and more interested in as a coach over the last couple of years, and kind of just beyond technical knowledge and the stuff that we know as a coach, the technical stuff, and actually using it in a way that creates meaningful change. And I think that's why I was so interested in listening to that. And I think it's very practical for coaches. It's a great tool for coaches.
Well, you mentioned there the conversations you were having weren't at the level you wanted them to be at. That intrigues me. Can you give me an example? Putting you slightly on the spot here, Stephen. Can you give me an example of a situation where you had a certain conversation with the player prior to expanding your knowledge about motivational interviewing and the techniques within, and the kind of conversation in a similar scenario that you might have now utilizing those techniques?
Yeah, definitely. So I think maybe not so much specific examples, but kind of general, pre and post that podcast and some of the understanding of motivational interviewing. I think my listening skills were probably not at a level that they should have been, even although I probably thought they were.
Okay.
And I would spend a fair amount of time waiting to implement the things that I felt were important for that player. So having a kind of a series of technical things that I wanted that player to do in order to get better, and not perhaps spending the time in the first instance just listening to the player and what factors they were bringing to the table and what their reasons for change were. So I would say it would be more of a kind of a waiting to speak and waiting to put my point across before I started to listen to the stuff on motivational interviewing. And then I would say after that, spending more time in what they would call the engaging process. So really spending more time in the first couple of sessions, not trying to necessarily just bring about change and change stuff so quickly, but actually understanding the person in front of me, what their motivations are for change, and then being able to actually start to get some momentum from there. So I think listening skills, if I was to summarize it, listening skills is the thing that I would say, had to work hard on at being better at. And what's great about motivational interviewing is it gives you a kind of a process and a structure in order to do that. So, for example, one of the tools that you use is what's called reflective listening skills, which I find really good, because as a coach, I'm always interested in. I always like to have, I suppose, structure around what it is that I'm doing, and I think it's really helped to be able to do that. So, reflective listening skills I've found has been a very useful tool, where before I would, I think, ask a lot of questions. I would say that I ask less questions now and use more reflective listening skills. So, for example, I can think of a player specifically who we were having a conversation, and he said to me, I'm nervous at the moment when I'm playing. And where previously I would have said something like, well, why are you nervous? Which is immediately going back with a question, which I think can put somebody under pressure a little bit, because they've almost got to solve that answer straight away. A reflective listening skill would be just capturing what they've said and giving it back to them. So it would be, so you're feeling nervous at the moment. So there's not a question, it's more of a statement to actually help the player understand that they've been heard. And then almost in every instance, using those tools, the player then offers more, and they start to give more that you're then able to use as a coach, and it just leads to better conversations.
A listening statement. It sounds to me like you're experiencing nerves when you're playing right now. I mean, Ian, those kind of listening statements can help us see the world through the player's eyes, can't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Since you said I was last year show in October 19, hopefully we're all kind of on an ongoing journey of learning as coaches. And Steve's really summed up for me with Rolnick's work. I'll talk a little bit later on about Paul McCarthy and his influence through your show, Dan. But without doubt, that whole thing of being a better listener. I remember Paul McCarthy actually saying it on your show. He said, we often don't listen because we're getting our answer ready. And just Steve has just said, that's, you think down to the pub conversations we have, and someone's telling a joke, you don't even hear that joke because you're getting your joke ready, at a leisure time level. So that kind of stuff resonates with it absolutely, as Steve said. And I remember Steve Rolnick on your show, he said that the turning point for him going back when he was still in nursing, and he found the more he kind of pushed people towards changing, the greater resistance. And the tragic case where one of his patients took his life, and that was a turning moment for him. Luckily, I've never been in a situation as serious as that with one of my clients, but that was certainly, for me and the kind of Paul McCarthy input, tremendously important. As Steve said, the quality of good questioning and listening, and that kind of empathetic position to understand the world they're in, and sometimes don't offer advice or offer remedies or solutions, but just the listening. I hear what you're saying, and that is a very important tool. Along with that, I guess that in the last 18 months with my PhD research, what we're talking about later on, and how I'm interviewing people, it's really shown me how much better my interviewing could be, and how kind of surface level it was in the past. I guess the point there was, if you don't really understand where the player is at, how can you really help them?
Yeah.
How can you really help them as well as you could do if you don't understand where they are at, the situation they're in, the kind of potholes they're maybe find themselves in? And that takes good questioning and a lot of listening and a lot of empathy, as Steve said.
Yeah, and just if I could just jump in there real quick, Dan, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
I think what motivational interviewing has done for me is it's made me more tuned to resistance in the player. So I'm more aware of resistance when I see it. And Stephen Rolnick talked about resistance coming from either someone's autonomy being undermined or a sense of distrust. And that trust takes time to build up. And again, that reflective listening, open-ended questions and taking a little bit longer to build that in the first instance definitely lowers that resistance. So I think it's definitely made me more tuned to when I see resistance in a player, and it can be very subtle, and it gives you kind of tools to break that down. When I notice resistance, I go back to more listening statements rather than asking so many questions, for example, and that I usually find really quite helpful.
It's such a different way of looking at coaching in many respects. I wonder if, as coaches, having been a golf coach like you guys, we're so socialized into what Steven Rolnick would call the writing reflex, and there's what both of you have alluded to this, that we want to provide solutions for the problems that our clients, the people that we're coaching, face. Almost built into the definition of coaching feels like this notion of, I have this knowledge and I've got to give you this knowledge, and I've got to give it to you as quickly as possible, because if I do so, then, hey, we've got a better chance of being successful here and we're going to have a great relationship. But it almost feels like actually taking a step back, saying, okay, right, stop, calm, relax, patient. And this is kind of your own self-talk as a coach. Let's just listen. Let's just listen to what this person is saying. And that active listening enables us to collect information, valuable information, that gives us a better chance of co-creating solutions with that person. No question, guys, but just a thought there.
Yeah, without doubt. I mean, it's as you say, with the socialization of the job we do, us trying to prove our value, Dan. I've got this knowledge, you're paying me whatever it is, number of pounds or euros per hour. You're looking for answers from me. Again, and we talked before briefly that one of maybe the few benefits of COVID has been the learning time we've all maybe been able to have, being at home or being on the road or doing a fitness with our podcasts. And another one that came from your show last year really enjoyed was Lawrence Allison, when he suggested you can only lead after you've listened. And that, I suppose that does take experience and some confidence yourself to just take a step back and say, okay, I'm going to listen as long as I need to, and really, as Steve said, actively listen to you to take in what I think you're hearing before I kind of take on the guidance role with you.
Absolutely.
And I think I think a lot of that's encompassed in empathy, and it's probably a word that I hadn't paid a huge amount of attention to. If someone had asked me, do you have empathy, I would like to think that I would have said yes. But again, I think what's great about MI is it kind of defines it and helps you understand more about what it is and its importance. And I remember in some of the training, it wasn't Steven Orr, I think it was Theresa Moyers was talking about psychotherapy, and one of the biggest predictors of successful outcomes in psychotherapy was the empathy of the therapist, which I thought was very, very interesting. And I thought, well, I wonder if that's the same or similar in sports coaching. I mean, as far as I'm aware, I don't think there's any studies that have been done on empathy as a predictor of outcome. But I thought, and it seems to have been done in psychotherapy, so I thought that's really quite interesting, and just defining what empathy is and what it isn't. And it's not about being overly nice or warm and fuzzy and overly agreeable necessarily. It's about being able to sit in somebody else's shoes and see their perspective. And how often do we actually experience that in life? How often do we have someone who actually spends time really listening to what it is that we're saying? And I think the answer is probably not that much. So I think when those skills can be developed as a coach, then the quality of work that you can do after that, I think, is hugely, it's much easier and it's more effective as well.
So if I had chosen Steven Orr to be my golf coach a year and a half ago, a couple of years ago even, as compared to now, what I would experience now, that the subtle or not so subtle changes might be that Steven Orr would be less quick to provide his solutions, would ask me more questions, listen more intently, reflect back what he's hearing, and use that information over time to find solutions or co-create solutions with me. Would that be about right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that would definitely be the starting point. I would say that's how we would kick off, definitely. And there's more to MI, as you well know, than that. That they would class that as the engaging process, which is the first part to be able to, if you don't get that right, it's difficult to do anything from there. So that would be definitely the starting point, and then you have the focusing, evoking, and planning stages. So there's a fair amount of structure to the process, but definitely that would be how I would try to start things off now with a player for sure.
That's really interesting, and so in terms of other things you've worked, other linguistic tools you've utilised from MI, moving deeper into into your coaching practice.
Yeah.
What else perhaps has changed or shifted? What else have you utilised that's been a positive influence on your coaching?
So with once you've gone past that engaging process with the player and then move into what they call focusing, so focusing on a specific topic that's relevant to the player. It might be, technical change. It might be working on mental skills on the golf course, learning to perform, whatever that topic is. There's a focusing element that gets down to kind of like, what do we need to work on? And then the evoking stage is, again, quite unique to MI, which is drawing out the person's reasons for change. So if somebody's going to change, there has to be a strong enough reasons for them to want to do that. It can't be just the coach saying, look, you need to do this, and that's it. That I found that to generally be kind of fairly ineffective. I mean, it works on some people, but when we can tap into somebody's reasons for change, then that's that's powerful over the long term. And what MI talk about is change talk and sustain talk. So, quite often in a conversation, you can hear someone giving good reasons why they want to change something and also why they don't want to change it. So, for example, I really want to change my swing because I want to get better, but I don't want to change too much because I'm playing well at the moment. I'll hear kind of similar conversations similar to that, where it's like, I want to change, but I don't want to change. And that evoking stage in MI is, again, being attuned. There's a kind of common theme for me, which is paying attention closely to those little moments of change talk. So when someone talks about the reasons for change, it's tuning into that and drawing that out, kind of pulling on that thread a bit more. And when you start to establish those reasons and build on those and talk on those, you're honouring that player's autonomy, but you're able to then start to create some, a sustainable plan that's based on, the changes that they're looking to make.
I think it's really fascinating, guys, because, to build on, this reinterpretation of coaching, I'm just thinking, as you were speaking there, Stephen, I just wonder if the master skill of coaching is the understanding of somebody's lived experience, essentially. It's that subjective experience. It's the subjective experience. What does somebody want? What does somebody want here? But also, what is somebody experiencing on the course or the court or the pitch? I mean, this is so relevant for soccer coaches, basketball coaches, etc. I mean, in golf coaching, you've got a client who comes to see you, they pay you money, and it's one-to-one, and there's that dynamic there. If you're coaching a team sport, it's a different dynamic. It's a group dynamic, and often you're giving your team, and you've got to accommodate every single player. And I think the default historically in team sports has been, well, the players have just got to do what I want them to do. And I set the culture, I'm the leader, quite top down, for instance. And I think what we're talking about here is such a crucial skill for coaches and philosophy for coaches to adopt. So a skill to develop and a philosophy to adopt, because I think it helps you as golf coaches to help you understand the lived experience of your clients and understand what they specifically want and how they want to go about doing it. And if you're a coach of a group, it can help you to coach each member of that group to understand the lived experience of each member of that group. And I'm using this term lived experience, which isn't a term normally used within sport or coaching, but I'm using it because I know, Ian, this is a massive part, or I believe this to be a massive part of what you're doing in your PhD, your doctoral studies. The way you're analysing people is by trying to understand their lived experience. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, fortunately, another game changer for me, Dan, say the last 18 months. And again, in science, they call it the phenomenology, but it's the study of the personal or lived experience that people go through. So kind of typical examples would be if you're coaching someone, let's say in my direction would be, how does a young tour player experience the first year on the European tour? What do they see? What do they feel? How do they feel? How are the interaction with other players, with the caddies, with management, with the TV, with the media? How does all that kind of stuff come together to create, as you say, the lived experience, the phenomenon of what they're going through. Another angle would be, let's say, a football player who's had a long-term injury and then needs to retire. How is that lived experience for him or for her as a sports person? And as you rightly said, coming back to that, if we, easy for me now to be a bit of a smarty pants on your show, but if we don't know those lived experiences, how can we then really help the player move forward with what he or she is dealing with? And I guess the second angle there as coaches would be, once I've gathered that knowledge of how players experience things, then obviously I've got the tools in my toolbox to help others coming behind them. So yeah, and that whole thing that life is subjective. If you go to it sounds a bit kind of sad theme, but how certain people experience the death of their parents, and that kind of closure process before you move on. So that's at the very kind of extreme. If you come back from there and kind of come into your world, let's say in football coaching, and another one that kind of fascinates me would be, let's say, a manager coming into the Premier League for the first time, stepping up from Division 1 or Division 2, and the coach or the manager is going into a team full of superstars. How does he experience those first few months coming in there where he maybe isn't the star of the team? It's all that kind of stuff. If he's being honest, being nervous, maybe feeling slightly inferior to his players, how are those early contacts in the changing room where I believe you've got maybe 5 minutes to win the changing room? And from there, I guess, as being a researcher, you think, okay, these are the lived experiences, and what were his or her coping skills to make the situation a successful one? Yeah, so that's really phenomenology, and it is fascinating. And from phenomenology, you talked about the study of that is this thing called IPA, which is Interpretive Phenomenological Analysis. It's a fancy name for researching small groups of individuals who go through similar experiences to see how they experience it similarly, but also the differences they experience. The experience, despite the situation being similar, how different people engage differently in the same situation. And that's kind of where I'm at with my PhD, and it is fascinating.
I bet it is. And so just to reflect back some of the things you said there, I mean, interpretative phenomenological analysis. Yeah. I've done well to get that out there.
Would you say that one time, Dan? IPA is good, yes.
Yeah. IPA, yeah, we'll shorten that. We love an acronym, IPA.
Yeah.
So with IPA, you're studying small groups, so say 4 to 6 people in a given environment, and your IPA is basically phenomenology.
Yes.
I'll say that again. Phenomenology
Yeah.
is the experience people have of their world,
Yes.
or their lived experience. And so in any given context, so it could be the European Tour, it could be a Premier League club, it could be a non-league club, it could be going for a lesson with Steven Orr. It could be anything. People have a certain experience. And so what you're studying is what experience are they having?
Exactly.
What experience are they having in this environment? So who's the group? What's the cohort that you're studying?
Yes, I've been very lucky, and the players have been very generous of their time. So I've got 13 players involved.
These are golfers from the European Tour.
These are all ex-European Tour players.
Okay. Yep.
So the cohort of 13, they played over 4,500 European Tour events. So they really were out there for a long time. Yep. So they had career lengths between, let's say, 5 years and over 20 years on the tour. They had a total of 26 wins on the European Tour. 3 Ryder Cup appearances and 1 major win. And the great thing with the group, Dan, as well, so there were, of the 13, 8 won tournaments and 5 didn't. So within there's a nice mix, and basically what I'm looking at is over the course of their careers, the different experiences they had during the highs and lows of their careers, and how they experienced that time, how they got through it, how they didn't, all the kind of challenges that came their way. And as I said before, the kind of big thing for me now is, and part of the material I'm still gathering, it'll be another 18 months in the process, is armed with that kind of knowledge to be able to advise others better in the future, players, caddies, coaches, parents, about the kind of things that players do go through that the press, don't hear about because it's very personal, it's sensitive, it's the kind of stuff that's very close to the bone.
But it leaves clues.
Oh, absolutely, without doubt. And on the great advice of my supervisor Martin Toms, he said a couple of years ago, he said we probably want to embargo this. If you want to find, which means it won't be released to the public, my findings. He said, if you want to really find out what these players are experiencing, this needs to be private. This needs to stay embargoed, so it won't go to the public, and allows the players to talk openly. And obviously, it's a fantastic honour that they give me to be able to have the depth of conversation I'm now having with them. So it is very much, it's biopsychosocial, it's their life model, and the challenges they went through during successful careers, and it wasn't all plain sailing and blue skies, as you can imagine.
What I think is fascinating so far about this conversation, guys, is that we're talking about a psychological framework in motivational interviewing that you've utilised, Stephen, to improve your coaching ability, capacity, and what motivational interviewing is in many respects all about. It's offering a framework that helps you to gather information from the individual in front of you and to a degree empower them. Some people wouldn't like that term empower, but let's just use it. Empower them to take a pathway towards finding their own solutions to a degree. And we're also talking about a research project that garners information from people who have been there and done that in a certain domain. So what I love about this from a coaching perspective is coach as skillful being, coach as a skilled profession. We're talking about the ability to utilize a psychological framework that helps us empower the player in front of us. But we're also talking about increasing our knowledge as a coach from those who've been there and done it in order to impart that knowledge or wisdom on the player in front of us. So we're kind of becoming better prescriptors, but we're also becoming better at empowering others to get the best from themselves. Does any of that make sense to either of you? It's kind of exploring both worlds, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I would say, Dan, something that Steve and I have talked about quite a bit in the past, would be, I think, again, critical of myself, certainly elite performance. We coaches have looked too often at what coaches have said and not enough at what past elite performers have said. And that's the big criticism of myself in the past. I tended to listen to every other coach and suck up what they said because they were available and it was out there. But really, I should have spent more time. This is what I've kind of luckily been able to do the last, 4 or 5 years. Let's talk to elite performers about what they've gone through. Because again, as Steve talked about empathy, if I can stand in their shoes, a bit more in their shoes, I can certainly advise others that want to stand in their shoes as well, probably better.
Yeah, absolutely. And just following on from that and from what you summarised there, Dan, I mean, for me, as coaches, we're going to give advice at some point to players, whether it's football coaches or golf coaches. There's going to come a time when we are going to give advice, and how that's accepted by the player, I think, is sometimes maybe under-considered as well. So if we dive in quickly and fairly straight off the bat, just tell players what to do, almost unsolicited, to me that doesn't work particularly well as a strategy. Whereas if we start the way that we've been talking about and understanding those lived experiences, practicing empathy, when the time comes to offer advice, I find that players are far more receptive to it. And I'm using the term offered advice rather than giving advice. That would definitely be my experience. I kind of think about it in the beginning of a relationship, like there's a power relationship there. And somebody has to yield. And is that the coach or the player? And for me, it has to be the coach who has to yield at the beginning. Because there's so much information and understanding that needs to be required in order to do quality work. And the benefit down the road is that when it comes to giving advice, the player is far more accepting of it because there's a trusting relationship been established there.
Yeah, one of the posits as well, Steve, the tenets of IPA is that the understandable, it sounds obvious, that the player is an expert on their own experiences. I can't tell them what they've been through.
Yeah.
And that's the starting point, Dan. Tell me what you've been through, tell me how you've seen this, and so that I can help to understand you better. And as Steve said, someone's got to yield. It's got to be the coach. Tell me what you're going through. Tell me what you see. And as Steve said, that takes time. I think the lucky thing for myself and Steve is, even if we're working in a group situation, it's maybe 5 or 6 players. And this must be difficult to do if you've got a squad of 20 players on the first team of any club you're going to work with. But God, I mean, I think that is the challenge. How do we connect with as many players as we can if you're involved in a team sport, to understand their world first of all? I remember Carl Morris on another podcast, he talked last year when he got into kind of performance psychology many years ago. And one of his first big clients was a Ryder Cup player that contacted him. And they sat down and had a chat, and Carl listened for an hour. And at the end of it, the player said, "That was great. I really learned a lot today." And Carl said himself, on his pod, I think it was back at the start of the lockdown, he said, "I hardly said a word, but it just showed the release the player needed at that time to, as Steve said, to kind of find a pathway to moving forward with the coach."
I had it yesterday, Ian. I did a session with somebody from the world of motorsport, and just by talking, this person said to me, "Well, that was cathartic. That really helped." At a stage in the session where I'd hardly said anything, I went on to talk about a few practical techniques. That's the direction the session went. But it was amazing, sort of halfway through, or even 3/4 of the way through. Wow, this is really helping me. So it's interesting, and it's reflecting on some of the things you've both said there. It makes me think of players come to your sessions with history that burdens them, and also history that bolsters them. And as you're both saying, you've got to get to know that. As you're saying, Ian, you've got to understand that. And as you're saying, Stephen, in many respects, to be able to get to know that, you've got to reduce your power and, in essence, reduce your threat or the perception of threat. And by giving the player the opportunity to express themselves and talk a bit about what they're thinking, what they're feeling around their lived experience. I think it's fascinating.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. Just for everyone listening, a tool that I found really useful was Thomas Gordon's 12 Roadblocks to Listening. It's something that's quite easy just to access on the internet, and it's a list of 12 things that gets in the way of our ability to listen. Things like directing, threatening, those are obvious, giving advice, persuading, asking questions, an interesting one, agreeing, judging. So, all of these things are kind of acts of the coach, which just kind of get in the way of just actually listening and paying attention to those, little pockets of change talk, or sustained talk, as they call it in MI. So it's, I think it's definitely an avenue worth pursuing for coaches who are interested in this stuff. It definitely can change behaviour down the road, effectively.
Yeah, I think just you and I chatted last week, Steve. Dan, Steve, and I, we've got a lot of people, a lot of WhatsApp group we communicate with. There's kind of 12 coaches in there, Steve. And I went back last week and looked at an old TED talk with Martin Seligman. You're talking about positive psychology, Dan. That was 2004 he did it. And which I know you know. And
Yep.
At the end of his talk, he talked about the kind of 3 kind of let's say positive lifestyles. It was pleasure, engaged, and meaningful. Meaningful be the one you're kind of giving back to society. And the point for me there was that all those in the meaningful life, as they were giving back, in our kind of small way as coaches, I don't think we can give back more than really hearing and listening to our clients. That's our kind of, at that moment, that input of giving. We're with our clients, we're being paid for it, not always, which is great as well. But that kind of giving aspect, and I think there's two angles there, Steve, was the obviously doing good by our clients, but also the feeling ourselves of contributing to the relationship. You know what I mean? That feeling good about yourself for putting the player ahead of our needs and wants at that moment.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
And a brief one there, sorry, because I'm on a bit of a flow. I'm sorry. Now I go back, it's just come to my mind there. And I remember a funny anecdotally, people laugh at this, I guess, or maybe stop the interview. But when we went to when we had our first child, myself and my wife, 8 years ago, and we went to the doctor, the paediatrician, and I said, do you have any tips for us on child rearing, being parents? And she said, you don't need to win every battle. Right, that's been one of the best advice I'd draw on most days. Like, how long can we watch the iPad for? 5 minutes, 10 minutes. When do we switch the TV off? When do kids need to go and put their pajamas on? What are they going to have for their tea? And that again, that's maybe a slight tangent here. I apologise, but again, part of the giving process. You don't need to win every battle with our children. We don't, but we do win by giving them again autonomy. I think there's something here that I can't identify, but there's a similarity in the background, I think.
I think you're right. I think, but again, I wonder if that comes back to that perception of coaching, the socialization of coaching into, I've got to have the knowledge, I've got to impart the knowledge, and that knowledge needs to be right. And it's not that when I say the knowledge needs to be right, one could perceive it to be right or not right. But the reality is the coach might think, well, I've just got to be seen to be right. I can't be seen to be wrong. I can't be seen to be, that's being seen to be weak. One last question on this is related to, I think, Stephen, you used the term directive. I suppose if we succinctly sum up what we're talking about here, it's on a continuum of directive to non-directive coaching. To put it in very simple tones, there must be a time, guys, because you guys are doing so much great work around, I suppose, being non-directive coaches to a degree. There's got to be a time when you've got to be directive. Coaching is an art or a craft, but are there specific times when you will be directive? Stephen, Ian, I mean, are there specific times where you really, really have to say, come on, this is what we need to be doing here. This is the way forward. This is the direction.
Yeah, in short answer, absolutely. That's what I was kind of alluding to before, when I was saying that there's going to be times when we give advice as coaches, but I think laying the groundwork early on with what we've been talking about means that when it comes time to give advice, the player is far more accepting of it because you've got a relationship established there. So I think when the time comes to give advice, and as you said, to say to the player, look, we really need to do this, or we need to change this, that ambivalence or that resistance that might normally have been there potentially can be reduced, and the player is more accepting and more trusting of what you're asking them to do. So I think definitely there's a time and a place to do that. I think it's different for different players for different reasons as well. So I think that decision-making process, is hugely important for a coach. It's not just what you do, but why you do it, when you do it, how you do it, and that's going to be different for everybody. So some players, for sure, you can be more directive, and others, you can be less so when it comes to the technical change element, which I think you're talking about.
I agree, Steve. I mean, there's definitely a time and a place to be a leader. A coach, and he takes someone from one place, another one. A guide doesn't walk behind the clients; he goes ahead of the clients through the jungle, through the bush, or through the caves.
Yeah.
But I like again what Lawrence Allison said. That was kind of good for me. Only lead once you've listened first.
Yeah.
So you've got the lie of the land, and then you lead. And I think a good point there is, again, think to yourself sometimes as a client, what would I want in this situation? If I go to my accountant, I want some direction. We'll talk about it, I've done my aims and this and that. And at some point, I'm paying him to give me some advice. I can take it or leave it, but I do want some guidance at some time. So yeah, there's definitely a coach is a leader. He should be as well.
Well, with that in mind, I like the accountancy analogy. I mean, what about beginner golfers, guys? Because I know you'll both be entrenched in working with the the more elite side of the game. But what about when a beginner golfer comes to you? I mean, how do you both treat that? Do you still go down the same path, or do you have a set system in place to introduce the game to somebody who's beginning?
Yeah, I mean, I can go first there, Ian. So it's still the same with a beginner in the sense that we start by sitting down and having a conversation for 20 minutes at least. So,
Okay.
I want to get to know that person, what their motivations are for being there. Where are they wanting to get to with their golf? What other experiences of learning skills have they had? So, some of those MI skills I'm trying to utilize for sure with somebody who's not played before, because everybody's a human being at the end of the day, So I think it's just exactly the same with a beginner golfer, and then in terms of actually, setting about improving their skills. I would spend quite a lot of time talking about the task or the objective of the skill, and quite a lot of time about the tool that they're using. So I would give them a chance. My preference, and I would never say this is the only way you do it, but my preference would be to give someone a chance to create movement based around the task and the implement that they're using, rather than kind of directly teaching them a set of movements that are going to allow them to hit the golf ball. That would be my starting point, really.
Yeah, similar. I've done a lot of, I guess, group coaching with beginners and adult seniors in the especially last 10 years. And again, as a framework, I look towards, Malcolm Knowles' work on andragogy, adult learning, and those kind of concepts there, especially, the bringing their past experience with them, what they've done previously in life and sport and their concepts and why they're there. So similar to Steve, kind of get to know them as a group, look for some group kind of group dynamic there, feeling comfortable within the group. What I do, which is a lot of fun, ask them to give themselves a name, the team name. So I've had, from the Desperate Housewives to Desperate Dan and his 5 amigos, all kinds of stuff. But again, just, what do people want? What are their needs? Ask them, and then that kind of move between being the listener and the leader. I've really enjoyed that. The kind of beginners group coaching in recent years, I guess, as I've learned more how people kind of tick, and really enjoyable experience as well.
Just briefly, just slightly more granular, Ian. So you have a group of, 6 to 8 beginner golfers come to see you. So what you don't do, for instance, is take them immediately out onto the range and start hitting golf balls, or immediately you start giving them an action that they can put into practice. You'll actually engage them in some form of conversation, get them talking amongst each other, have some fun, create a group name, and build from there. That's kind of what I'm hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to give you a kind of brief run through, so if beginners come to our club, I'll meet them at the clubhouse. One of the things I've learned over the years, to remember the names quicker, normally with some kind of eye catch, the clothing they're wearing or an association with something else. Groups of not as big as 8, maybe, Dan, between maybe 3 and 6.
Okay.
So within that first minute, I want to know their name. Everyone loves their own name. To kind of get their name kind of battened down as quick as I can the first or second time of asking.
Yep.
And actually introduce them to the game and the club and where are they. It's like people sometimes going into a restaurant they've been recommended and they go in kind of warily. they've got the money in their pocket and they've been to a lot of restaurants. This is new, and will we fit in here, and what's the kind of the formalities of ordering food, and what's the prices like, and what the wine's like. So it's not just playing a game; it's the whole culture. Again, we're back to your psychosocial aspects that we've talked about in the past. So really, what I'm trying to do with that first contact, they probably won't swing a club until maybe half an hour after we've met them. But that half an hour, I'm really trying to create bridges to them, have them feel comfortable, know that they know that I know their name or use their name regularly, discuss all the kinds of stuff that maybe again, this lived experience, that lived experience is going to be of value to them. Where do we get the ball machine? What kind of money do they need to buy pool balls from the ball machine? Where do they chip and putt? And the whole the clothing aspect, we welcome jeans, we welcome trainers, we welcome t-shirts, we welcome tattoos. We're a modern club and you are our guests. So before we even get to the game, I guess I'm trying to set out the kind of cultural aspects of that they are the customer's king and everyone's welcome. This is a game for everyone. That's way before we get towards the technical stuff.
Fascinating. All very psychosocial, driving the experience, driving technical, tactical, and physical, driving participation, progression, and performance. And I know that, Steven, again, before coming on air, we spoke about some of the things that we wanted to talk about and address based on your learning, your development alongside Ian's. And one of the things that you've embraced over the last, 12 months, 2 years, are PCDEs, so psychological characteristics of developing excellence.
Yeah.
I spoke in episode 44 to Dr. Andy Hill about these. He utilises PCDEs with Blackburn Rovers Football Club.
Yeah.
Talk to me about PCDEs, Steven. When did this start? When does this love affair start? And how are you doing it? And what's going on there?
Well, so yeah, I mean, I've looked at them, studied them, read the papers for a number of years now. So, like, the background is it's Dave Collins and colleagues. It's PCDs came from there. I know you know that. I'm just in terms of anyone listening. It's based on about 25 years of research, and just recently they produced the PCDEQ, which is a questionnaire which allows a coach, a practitioner, to do a kind of a factor analysis, they call it, which allows a profile of a player and then gives an ability to be able to start to apply some of those PCDs to bring about change. And for me, it's definitely not about trying to be a psychologist and trying to do what you do at all. It's more, because I'm a coach at heart, but it's more kind of through demand almost. It's almost like, being at tournaments with players, it's like I've just got problems that I have to solve, and a lot of them are psychology-based problems. So anything that's beyond any ability of mine, I would refer on. But it's really just trying to upskill to be able to help players in a fairly basic way with psychology. And I found the questionnaire very, very good. And what it does is it produces a measure of what's called 7 factors, which are active coping, imagery and active preparation, using social support, self-directed control and management, clinical indicators, perfectionist tendencies, and adverse response to failure. And those seem to have a high predictive value in terms of who's successful and who's not. So it's a pretty valuable tool to use, and I use it from a triangulation point of view. I don't base all my decisions just on that, but I definitely use it to inform what I'm seeing and how I'm looking at a player.
What do you mean by a triangulation perspective?
Well, so rather than just getting the result of a questionnaire and saying that's what the questionnaire says, so we're going to do some work on that. Looking at it from different perspectives. So, what am I observing as a coach? What is the player talking about? and what is the profile telling us? And if those three kind of line up, then I'd be reasonably confident that that's the direction that we should be going. So not just kind of basing my decision on one factor. So it's used. I find it's really useful to support what the player is saying and what I'm seeing as well. And just one further quick point is that of those 7 factors, the 2 that are regarded as the most important is active coping and adverse response to failure as well, Dan. So that's been very interesting in terms of how I'm seeing those 2 factors. Does the player in front of me have coping skills? So one of them's good, one of them's bad. Do they have coping skills when they step into the performance environment? And if they don't, how do we develop them? And what is their relationship with failure? Is somebody not prepared to take any risks, for example? I think I can reasonably tell if somebody's has an adverse response to failure because they just don't look like they ever want to try new stuff. For example, I often see that in players, that they just want to do what they need to do to try and perform rather than have the freedom to go out and try stuff that's going to make them better in the future. So sorry, that's a rather long-winded start off on that.
No, interesting. And have you got? Are there any examples you can give us in terms of utilising the questionnaire with a player? Obviously, Stephen, you won't name names, but I'm guessing you're giving these to your players, and so you're getting some data back. Can you give us a sort of a case study that's been, whether you can call it successful or informative, where you've utilised this questionnaire and you've got some data back and you've utilised it?
Yeah, absolutely. So one example would be a very high-performing player plays on one of the top tours. We went through the questionnaire, and he came out as low in terms of imagery and active preparation. And we'd had a discussion around not using imagery particularly well in the past within his game. But what the questionnaire did is it gave me a prompt. It's almost like it flagged up again that using imagery was not something that was being utilised particularly well. And that can be in terms of making skill changes to mechanics. It can be visualising shots in tournaments. And what it did is it gave us a prompt to actually intentionally develop those behaviours, those observable behaviours within his practice. So rather than it just being something that was part of a conversation, the questionnaire prompted me to actually say, right, we're going to implement this in a structured way. And it led to some good performances within the next 3 or 4 weeks, actually, in some key events. Now, I suppose that's the challenge, isn't it, of psychology, as you know much better than me. It's, how do we know that it was that thing that made the difference? It's always a hard thing to really measure, but my feeling and his feeling is that it was an important factor, and it's now an ongoing part of his weekly practice. So I think that's an example of, it's just brought more structure and order and more consistency around, right, here's some behaviours that we need to implement, and let's get on with doing it.
I think questionnaires can get a bad rap, but I find them brilliant at starting. They're for great conversations. They can start great conversations. Ian, have you come across PCDEs at all?
Yeah, sure, Dan. I guess one of the early units we had at uni at Birmingham back in 2014, I think we stumbled over PCDEs that was introduced. I just used them actually last year. Obviously, they're changing landscape. Steve talks there about the PCDEQ, the questionnaire. I can still hang on to the slightly earlier work, and I worked with the National Golf Federation last year with 12 of the elite coaches. Introduced the kind of slightly earlier frameworks, which I like as well, and it's really manageable. It's bite-sized chunks of pearls of wisdom, I think, and introduce them to the coaches as tools for them to use, looking at themselves. Dan, how's my coaching? the tools behind my coaching, again, things like kind of social skills or social support, reflective practice, your planning, goal setting, all the kind of good stuff we know or we've heard of kind of on different aspects, but the PCDs bring them nicely into one package. And obviously, Steve talked there about the work of Collins and Matty Mara going back to Orlick and what have you back in the late or the early 2000s. This is coming from the coalface. This is what top athletes have thought and done and acted in the past. So if that's something that top athletes can do, coaches can really take on board as well. And my work as a consultant with coaches, I've got kind of 5 or 6 guys on my books at the moment that help kind of elite coaches and national coaches. And the actual social support is one of the big one where they tend to fall down. The coach, again, we talked about being a giver before, but also, what's in it for me as a coach, and who's there for me at the end of the day when the coach is making tough decisions? Who's there to talk to at the end of the day regarding where am I going to go with this player, or where am I going to go with this management decision, or the issues of money and finance and contractual deals, So it's a really good framework. I like it as well. Big fan of Dave Collins' work anyway, and how he sees the world. And PCDs, yeah, love them.
I think it goes back to Orlick and Partington in 1988, and I think that obviously Anya McNamara and Dave Collins, as you say, have built on that over the last 30 years, and it has a very strong body of evidence and is a very practical tool for both players and coaches to use and to help coaches understand players better. Just another source of information. And I love that notion of triangulation, Stephen. I love that notion of, we're not going to use this as an isolated piece of data. It's also what I see. It's also what the player's saying. Yeah. It's perhaps also gathering data from the people around the player, Ian, as well. For both of you here, I suppose the more data you have, data is quite a cold term, isn't it? But the more qualitative and quantitative information that you have, the more informed you can be with your decision making as a coach.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, knowledge is king.
I'd agree with that. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I know you're. I've heard you say in quite a few of your podcasts, Dan, that you're interested in personality science. You're interested a lot in that, and that's something I don't really know much at all about. And does that have questionnaires at their basis as well? I mean, I'm familiar, obviously, with.
Yeah, look, I mean, the gold standard would be the NEO, which essentially measures the 5. What could be considered the leading 5 personality traits that we have, and that has a good 40-50 years of evidence behind it. And I find it useful, and actually we could relate that to what, in essence, you were speaking about earlier, which is when somebody comes, and yourself, Ian, when somebody comes to a session, they bring with them a set of characteristics, and we can't just assume that somebody wants to be, they definitely want to be taught in this way, or they're definitely going to be like this, and so subsequently they're going to behave like this, or they're going to be conscientious practitioners. Everybody is different, and I think what personality science is basically saying, it's not saying that everybody is a certain way all the time. It's very much oriented towards an individual's interaction with their environment. But what it's saying is that human beings have a typical response in given situations. They have a typical response. And so what personality science investigates is, what is that typical response? I'm quite introverted. On an extroversion scale, I'm quite introverted. That's how I test. I have times when I'm very extroverted. Certainly, Stephen, you've seen me present, and I'm quite lively doing presentations. And I wouldn't come.
I get tired of looking at you sometimes.
Right, fair enough. I feel knackered after them, I can assure you. But I wouldn't come across as an introvert. But absolutely, inside of me, there's certain circumstances that would really tire me out. And so what I love about personality science is when somebody fills in an NEO accurately, you get a hidden viewpoint of the person, the intrapersonal characteristics that they have. And I think that makes a difference to how they engage in sport, how they engage with coaches, how they engage in a specific environment, how they engage with their teammates. And everything that you guys are talking about kind of lends towards understanding. You won't use an NEO, you won't use necessarily a personality test, but you're interviewing them, you're having a conversation over a cup of coffee, and you're ascertaining who they are. And then you, through your experience of coaching, through your experience of people, you're acting accordingly, essentially. So I really think it collides with everything that you guys are doing.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it just, to me, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, to have more information at your disposal, just informs your decision. You've got a better basis then, surely, to make an informed decision on your choice of action.
Yeah, sure. And I think, everyone was a person before they became a sports person. So, absolutely, and nature, nurture, the balance, who they are when they step on the first tee for the first time, or on the football ground for the first time. Yeah, absolutely. You're bringing your past with you, your biography, and all those nature, nurture ingredients with you, aren't you?
Guys, what a great conversation. What a great conversation. Thank you so much. And as always, I know that level of conversation will tap the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience, who will be keen, I'm sure, to learn more about what you're doing and follow you where they can follow you. So with that in mind, Steven, how can people follow you and your work? And if you're willing to allow people to get in touch with you, how can they do so?
Yeah, no problem at all. I'm not actually a social media user, believe it or not. But if anyone wants to get in touch with me, my website, stevenorcoaching.com, they can get hold of me that way, no problem at all.
Perfect. And Ian?
Yep, I'm still quite keen on Twitter, Dan, so it's at Ian Peak Coaching, all one word. My email is mail@nms-golf.com. So mail@nms-golf.com.
Brilliant. Well, look, I'm so grateful for your time, guys. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
Enjoyed it.
Pleasure, and thanks for having us on. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Steve.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.